Okay, well, welcome everyone who's joined us. It's now 2 minutes past 11, so we will make a start. Welcome to this Behavioural Research UK webinar. BR UK is a leadership hub for behavioural research in the UK, and we're funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. You can see in this starting slide just some of the main points about how the webinar is run, but we'll now just move on to the title slide. So today you're going to be listening to findings from a very rapid study that we conducted in Behavioural Research UK in collaboration with a number of other researchers, including Professor John Drury from the University of Sussex, who's joined us today, but a number of other colleagues as well, and we're very grateful to them. So we'll be learning more about the 2024 English riots and insight into social unrest and racial dynamics. And I know you're going to find this interesting. I'm just going to show you who's speaking in a second. So just to take you through some of the process elements, you know how long the webinar is going to last. The chat is disabled in the format we used in Zoom, and that's because we would like you to put your questions, if you have any, and please think of questions as you're listening to my colleagues in that Q&A tab that you can see at the bottom there. So that's where to put the questions in. And then if you see questions that others are putting in there and you think, oh, that's a really good question, I'd like to see that asked, then just you can vote on it, and that will make sure that those questions go to the top. And if you require closed captioning, you can see the instructions there, so please do turn that on if that would be useful. So we've got a number of speakers who've joined us today. John's going to give some opening remarks, and then John's also going to highlight the findings and implications at the end before we go into the Q&A. And then we're going to hear the case study findings from Stoke, from Tamworth, and from Bristol. And I'm just very briefly going to say a few things about our speakers. So again, thank you to John for this collaboration. We've learned a lot from him. He's a professor of social psychology at the University of Sussex, and his research focuses on collective action, collective behaviour in emergencies, and live events. And he developed the social identity model of collective resistance. So he's very experienced, has had a wide variety of different roles. And I think you'll be able to hear that coming through when you listen to him today. He was also on SPI-B during the pandemic, and he currently sits on the Cabinet Office Behavioural Science Expert Group. Dr. Julze Alejandre is going to be discussing the case study in relation to Stoke-on-Trent. He's one of the research fellows in BRUK, working in particular on public engagement and stakeholder involvement approaches, as well as equality, diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality principles. And before he joined academia, Julze had a wide variety of roles. He was a health promotion and policy specialist for government and international NGOs in Philippines and the UK, focusing on food, nutrition, and health and social care policies. And his PhD is in sustainable healthcare and implementation science as a Scottish Government hydronation scholar at Glasgow Caledonian University here in Scotland. And Niamh Hart, also a BRUK fellow, she focuses on the qualitative aspects of building capability in behavioural research and a wide variety of other activities for the hub. And she recently completed her PhD in the Physical Activity for Health Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh with an interest in health behaviours. And Dr. Kitty Saunders is going to be focusing on the Bristol case study. She's a senior policy fellow at University College London, and she has a BSc and MSc in experimental psychology and forensic mental health research, and then also a PhD in psychiatric epidemiology from King's College London. And she also worked prior to that as in the policy research unit for mental health as a postdoctoral research associate. So some fantastic speakers we have today, and I'm going to hand over now to John. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So if you cast your minds back to summer last year, you'll remember that after the murder of 3 schoolgirls in Southwick, in Southport, there was a wave of disorder, riots, across the UK, towns in England overwhelmingly. And this was the biggest wave of riots we've seen in this country since 2011. It consisted of around 29 events across 27 towns and cities, lasting around 7 days. And in terms of what happened at those riots, They were characterized in particular by people attempting to attack or actually attacking the accommodation where asylum seekers were staying, and sometimes mosques as well. So when a national crisis like this happens, there is obviously a need amongst behavioural scientists, policymakers and others to understand why this happened, how this happened, and of course what can be done about it. And suggestions were made and policy initiatives were proposed from very early days. But policy decisions really need a correct and accurate understanding of the nature of the events. And one of our motivations for looking closely at the events of 2024 was the experience of some of us in looking at the events of 2011, where policy responses were sometimes rushed out on the assumption about what happened and who took part in those events in 2011. For example, that people in 2011 came from troubled families, and therefore the solution was a troubled families program. That suggestion without any evidence. And so we proposed and put together a plan, a program of research on the recent riots, using multiple methods with a large team. And we began that in August, the same months as the riots were happening. And we had funding for around 7 months. And we set out a number of questions. First of all, given there were so many assumptions about who took part, that they were all far right, perhaps, one question we asked was, well, who were these participants? A second question was to do with how they were policed, what was the nature of policing in these events. In some of the previous riots we've looked at, the form of policing has contributed to the escalation of conflict. We wanted to know whether that was the case here. And thirdly, there were other groups involved. There were counter-protesters involved in these events, and we wanted to know what the nature of their activities was. We had a fourth question too, which is the one I've grayed out there, which was the effect of these events on the perceptions and the beliefs of the general public, including those who might be the targets of these events, ethnic minorities. It's grayed out because we didn't get around to answering that question. We didn't have enough data of that, but that was how we started. So a brief word on what we did, the research design. We had capacity to look at 3 of the locations where disorder took place. And these are the 3 case studies you're going to hear about in a moment. And our basic approach to answer those questions I set out was to analyze in detail what actually happened, what people did in as much detail as was possible. And to do that, we triangulated multiple sources, including all available videos, news articles, police arrest data, social media data, interviews, and official documents. And we based that on a program of work, the program of work we did in 2011, which was a larger program, which I think was successful in understanding the nature and spread of those events. So that's a bit of the background. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to the first presenter.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. My name is Julze Alejandre. I'm a research fellow in public engagement at the University of Edinburgh. And today I am presenting a case study of the anti-immigration and anti-Islam riot that occurred in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent on 3rd of August, 2024. Before I proceed, I would like to be transparent with my positionality that might have influenced how we analyze the data for this case study. I'm a Southeast Asian immigrant in the UK, and as a public health specialist, I investigated and analyzed the data in this case study using a health and well-being lens. I would also like to thank the contribution of Roger Ball and Julze Bauld in this research. And before I go on the next slide, I would like to warn our audience that some of the slides in my presentation contain graphic images and descriptions of violence, so viewers' discretion is advised. Next slide, please. So here's an overview of what I'll cover today. First, the context of Hanley, then the data sources we use for these case studies. I'll then outline the profiles of the groups involved in the riot before walking through the 5 phases of the riot. I'll then present the spatial analysis of the data, followed by the key insights and implications, and finally, the arrestee data and the remaining gaps and questions. Next slide, please. So Hanley is one of 6 towns in Stoke-on-Trent, and it faces chronic economic challenges. Demographic data from the Office for National Statistics show that the Hanley and Etruria ward has the highest proportion of unemployed and economically inactive residents in the city. It has also a high proportion of Asian residents and one of the largest Muslim populations in the region. Hanley has hosted a notable number of asylum seekers as part of the UK government's dispersal program. The area has also been historically associated with far-right activism. The British National Party, for example, and the English Defence League were both active here. The Hizb ut-Tahrir, a proscribed extremist group, also had a presence in the area in the past. So these elements combined to create a context in which tensions could be easily reignited, making it an attractive site for far-right rallies. Next slide, please. Stoke has a long history of racialized protest. In 2001, riots broke out over false rumors involving the British National Party. In 2010, the English Defence League staged a protest here that saw attacks on Muslim businesses. And in 2017, the Britain First leaders also spoke at a far-right rally in the area. Tensions rose again more recently, particularly around proposals to convert a local church into a mosque and the use of hotels for asylum seekers or for asylum accommodation. These events form a continuum of far-right activities that shape riot in summer of 2024. Next slide, please. For this case study, to draw a timeline of the riot that happened in Hanley on the 3rd of August, we analyzed a total of 144 primary and secondary data sources. So these included photos, videos, social media posts from Facebook, from Twitter or X, press articles, blog articles, police reports, and 13 interviews with witnesses, counter-protesters, and police officers. So this mix of primary and secondary data sources allowed us to verify when and where things happened and to some extent, why things happened. Next slide, please. The riot in Hanley have seen 6 prominent figures. First are the anti-immigrant participants, or groups composed of around 400 individuals. These were mainly white men, aged 30 to 60 years, and some with links to football risk groups. The second profile of figures are community defenders composed of around 100 masked men, largely South Asian and Black young men, who mobilized to defend local mosques in the area. There were also counter-protesters composed of around 70 individuals affiliated largely with anti-racist groups such as North Scarf and Stand Up to Racism. There were also around 60 public order trained police officers deployed during the riot, and online far-right promoters who were not involved in the riot physically but were sharing posts about the riots online, and also members of the public. Next slide, please. So the almost 9-hour riot in Hanley had 5 phases. First is a mobilization phase, which involved gathering of police intelligence about the riot and preparation. Assembly phase involved meeting and assembly points, organization, and setting up. Movement phase, which involved mobilization of anti-immigrant participants to move from assembly point to targeted attack points. The attacks on mosques, which involved verbal and physical clashes between the anti-immigrant participants, community defenders, and police officers. And lastly, the dispersal phase, which involved winding down and complete dispersal following a cycle of dispersal, regrouping, and clashes or attacks. Next slide, please. So this map presents the spatial view of the key sites during the riot. The geography of Hanley influenced how events unfolded. Figure 1 shows the movement of the anti-immigrant participants during the movement phase, and Figure 2 shows the movement of the anti-immigrant participants and community defenders during phase 4, or the attacks on mosques. I'm going to describe more in detail each phases of the riot. Next slide, please. So after the Southport murders, rumors circulated about protests in Stoke-on-Trent on 1st of August. A Facebook event under the slogan "Enough is Enough" began gaining online traction. And with this, Staffordshire Police identified the risk of the potential event and implemented a 12-hour shift for frontline officers, ran reconnaissance, engaged with Stoke Council and other potential target community organizations during the event. They also planned to deploy around 60 public order trained police officers before the event happened. Next slide, please. By 9 a.m. on August 3rd, far-right groups started gathering at nearby Wetherspoons, and around 70 counter-protesters also assembled near the town hall around 10 in the morning. At around 11 in the morning, 100 anti-immigrant participants left Wetherspoons and walked to the Smithfield Centre, escorted by the police. On the way to the Smithfield Centre, they passed through the town hall, and the group attempted to charge the counter-protesters but was intercepted by the police officers. They then continued marching down to the Smithfield Centre, which is the assembly point of the protest. At 11:30 in the morning, about 400 anti-immigrant participants had gathered at Smithfield Centre. The crowd was composed of largely white and middle-aged men carrying flags of St. George's, the Knights Templar, Union Jacks, some Israeli flags, and England football flags. Next slide, please. Less than 15 minutes after gathering at the Smithfield Centre, the anti-immigrant participants abruptly turned south, running towards Shelton area, which is a racially diverse neighborhood. The police had anticipated such movement and had placed a police cordon to block the anti-immigrant crowd. And after being blocked, the crowd returned to the Smithfield Centre, then began moving to Broad Street, then to March Street and Trinity Street. At this point, the anti-immigrant crowd attempted to approach the Best Western Contingency Hotel for Asylum Seekers, which prompted a new police cordon. And then blocked again, they changed course down Stafford Street and reached by Albion Pub at around 1 p.m. The pub is just 50 meters from the town hall, which is the assembly point of the counter-protesters. And between the anti-immigrant participants and the counter-protesters, a tense standoff followed, with both sides exchanging chants and insults. Next slide, please. While the standoff is happening at the Albion pub, a breakaway group split off and ran towards north and reached the Darul Falah Center, where the anti-immigrant group clashed with community defenders of about 50 black-hooded and young unarmed men of South Asian and African descent. A tipping point came when misinformation spread offline and online about the alleged stabbing of a white man near the Darul Falah Center. Although this claim was quickly disproven by the police, it could have been inflamed tensions and catalyzed further clashes towards another mosque. And while this clash is happening at the Darul Falah Center at around 2:30 p.m., counter-protesters started to pack up and left the town hall thinking that the event is already over. Next slide, please. Shortly after the alleged stabbing incident near the Darul Falah Center, the attention of the anti-immigrant participants shifted to Masjid Salahuddin, near the Central Forest Park. At around 3 p.m., another clash broke between the anti-immigrant participants and Asian young men who had mobilized to defend Masjid Salahuddin. This phase saw a cycle of clashes, dispersal, and the grouping of anti-immigrant participants and community defenders. The community defenders were at the elevated side where the mosque is, and while the anti-immigrant participants were at the lower side of the bank. Individuals were running around cars, bricks and blunt objects are being thrown from the other side. And at this point, the police officers deployed a containment strategy, which was discussed with the imam of the mosque to establish cooperation between the police officers and the Asian young men. Police officer also instructed the Asian young men to discard the weapons at the mosques. Next slide, please. After almost 3 hours of cycle of clashes, dispersal, and regrouping, at around 30 p.m., the group of anti-immigrant participants and Asian males started to dwindle. Some left to watch a football match scheduled during the day. At this point, police issued dispersal orders, and eventually Asian young men were contained in the car park near Masjid Salahuddin were released. Some members of the anti-immigrant participants and community defenders were seen roaming around the town center, and at the day of the riot, police reported a number of arrested individuals. Next slide, please. Gathered arrestee data covered around 94 arrests during the day, or which were associated in the Hanli riot, and majority or 93% of them, of those arrested, had prior offenses, mostly for violence. The average age of the arrestees was 31 years, and around 80% of those arrested individuals are either unemployed or had manual jobs. Around 3/4 or 73% were local to Stoke-on-Trent. Next slide, please. The riot in Hanley raises some significant points in terms of its impact on society. First, the targets chosen tell us about the ideology of the anti-immigrant participants. These were not random attacks. Second, the use of ethnic shorthand like Asian youth or Muslim to describe people of color who were involved in the riots could feed into more racialization, marginalization, and division, or racialized panic. Third, the trauma caused by the riot is significant. It impacted children, business, shop owners, and local residents. Fourth, there is a potential to create more division when we demonize or vilify certain groups on how we report and describe these events. Fifth, misinformation and disinformation spread offline or online played a decisive role in escalating violence and more division. And lastly, systemic problems such as socioeconomic deprivation, poverty, and lack of opportunities can contribute to the development of these violent ideologies. Next slide, please. There are gaps in this desk-based review. There are still some undocumented gaps and missing information, especially from the point of view of asylum seekers, refugees, and ethnic minority and non-participants. There's also need to expand the counter-protest that happened on the succeeding Saturday after the riot. And we also need to better understand and verify how some media or how some social media posts influence the behavior of all the groups involved in real time. Thank you for your listening, and I'm going to turn it over to Niamh, who's going to discuss the riot in Tamworth.
Hey, morning everyone. I'm Niamh Hart. I am presenting an account of the Tamworth events that happened on August 4th, 2024. And again, the language that we use today is based on the language that was used from the resources that we used. Next slide, please. This slide outlines the presentation of the case study. And first we will begin to explore the sources of our information and build context to the events before diving into actually what happened on the day. Next slide, please. So the following account of the riot in Tamworth on Sunday the 4th of August is based on the triangulation of sources to determine when and where events occurred, including their content and who was involved. The sources include time-stamped video and photographic evidence, newspaper and blog articles, social media posts, and reports to central government. Next slide, please. We also utilised anonymised data on arrestees and interviews with eyewitnesses, police officers, and counter-protesters. Next slide, please. So just to build a little bit of context, I'm going to talk about the area of Tamworth. And it's a town in Staffordshire close to Birmingham with a population of around 79,000, according to the data from the Office of National Statistics in 2021. Of that, 91% of those were born in England. The town is predominantly made up of just under 50% of Christian and 44% of non-religious residents. Almost 96% of residents are white, with the rest identifying as either mixed ethnicity, and around 2% either Black, Asian, or other. And lastly, around 93.5% identify as either British, English, or a mixture of both. Next slide, please. So beginning the data collection, it was quickly discovered that Tamworth already had a lot of rising tension that may have led or contributed to the events that occurred. So from around September of 2022, asylum seekers were housed in the Holiday Inn Express in Tamworth, and this caused Conservative MP Robert Pritchard to publish a series of posts on his social media, including this one on August 1st, sorry, which directed people to a change.org petition, which opposes the use of Tamworth as a suitable location to house the asylum seekers. Over the next 2 years that the hotel was open to asylum seekers, there was known tension with the local businesses and the asylum seekers housed in the hotel. This included the Snowdome, which is an indoor skiing venue, and it's very popular with locals and tourists and sits beside the Holiday Inn Express. Interviews stated that employees of this local business and others refused the asylum seekers entry on multiple occasions. And the residents of the Holiday Inn Express complained that they were being treated poorly by the community, and there was reports being made to the Borough Council of incidents of discrimination against the asylum seekers, ranging from hate crimes and verbal abuse to refusal of nearby retail outlets. Attempts by one community organisation to engage the asylum seekers with the nearby football club, Tamworth FC, were rebuffed by the club's management, suggesting that opposition to their presence at the hotel. The hotel itself was also a target for protests by the far-right party, Britain First, which is a neo-fascist political party, and in October 2022, they targeted Tamworth for its anti-immigration propaganda by issuing an online video focusing on the hotel. Around a year later, the Britain First activists returned, staging a protest outside the hotel. The party claimed that they had distributed 6,000 packs to postal voters and 10,000 leaflets to houses in the constituency. This propaganda directly referenced the Tamworth Holiday Inn and accused the then Conservative government of using Tamworth as a dumping ground for working-age illegal migrant men. There were also instances of locals raising concerns where the asylum seekers' behaviour, including in June 2024, just before the actual events, whereby a local posted on a Facebook page with nearly 60,000 followers called Spotted Tamworth that a few meals housed at the Holiday Inn hotel had propositioned and harassed 2 young 15-year-old females near the Snowdome complex. This online post gained a lot of traction, with many expressing their anger and frustration at the ongoing housing situation at the Holiday Inn. Some of the comments on this post alluded to another Facebook page that had been pulled together, and this was called Tamworth Pull Together and Make a Stand, which has since been deleted. This deleted Facebook page was the place that the event on August 4th was ultimately arranged and advertised. And lastly on this slide, on July 17th, 2024, just 5 days before the event at the hotel, another Tamworth MP, Labour candidate Sarah Edward, made a speech regarding the use of the hotel of asylum seekers, stating that residents of Tamworth want their hotel back. Next slide, please. So although the Facebook page advertising the protest had been deleted before the data collection for this study started, luckily a blog named Debunking Tamworth had collected an array of screenshots from it, which you can see here on this slide. Next slide, please. Now, before we go into the events that occurred, I'm just going to present a map of the Holiday Inn location, which you can see here. It was located on the outskirts of the town centre, very close to the Snowdome complex that we mentioned, and there were asylum seekers often refused entry from. It was also very close to the Tamworth Football Club, which is relevant as we get to the next phases. Next slide, please. So this next slide presents what we describe as the 6 main phases of the events on August 4th in Tamworth, beginning with phase 1, which is preparations for the event. Next slide, please. So phase 1 details what we understand the community and the police to know before the events actually occurred. Social media posts and the online protest advertisement, which you can see here on the right-hand side, did not go unnoticed. It was raised at a meeting in July 2024 with representatives from the Home Office, Staff's Police, and Serco, which is a security organisation based at the hotel. and then again at a subsequent meeting on the 1st of August. The head of the security team for the hotel in Tamworth noted that he was aware of a potential protest about 3 or 4 weeks beforehand, and according to him, there was strong intelligence that there was going to be something happening. A local volunteer for an NGO facilitating hate crime education noticed the e-flyer in the early evening of Saturday, the 3rd of August, and immediately sent it to the chief inspector and the knowledge hub at the staff's police. And despite this, according to the police, the intelligence was really thin around Tamworth. On the day, 2 police support units, a dog serial and a drone team, some intelligence officers, and a police liaison team were then deployed to Tamworth. Next slide, please. So we're now moving on to the events that actually occurred on August 4th, and phase 2 includes the gathering of a so-called peaceful protest. The online post which was being circulated stated that the protest would begin at 7 p.m. outside the Holiday Inn, and at around 5 p.m. beforehand, police met at Tamworth Football Club for a briefing, and at around 6 p.m. the police liaison team were deployed at the hotel close by, supported by police support units. At 6:30, there were around 50 to 100 protesters, with the general reaction to the police from the protesters seen as negative. As the protesters began to mobilise, around 10 to 15 local pro-refugee, anti-racist and anti-fascist individuals also arrived at the hotel. These included some members of the National Stand Up to Racism organisation and the local Against Racism Tamworth, who organised a counter-protest through their WhatsApp group. From around 7 p.m, police began to receive reports of at-risk football fans attending a nearby match at the Tamworth Football Club, where they were making their way to the event. At 7:20, 250 protesters were then present, and this included the football fans and family groups, many with masks. At this stage, police and counter-protesters were described as being outnumbered, and phase 2 is what one police officer from the interviews describes as instantaneous violence. Interview data suggests that police felt threat by protesters wanting to gain access to the hotel and therefore formed a protective line outside of the hotel entrance. And at 7:26, a man with a megaphone encourages protesters to advance. And from video footage, we can see that about half of the crowd react to this man. From 7:46, missiles, fireworks, and flares are thrown at the police line and counter-protesters. And at this point, pepper spray and batons were used by police on those who attacked the police line, and police began to change into their protective kit. A police drone was also seen flying above, sending information to police commanders. The participants continued to pelt the police line and counter-protesters with missiles and fireworks, and after 2 of the counter-protesters were hit with fireworks, the group retreated away from the entrance to the hotel, but they continued to wave in support of the asylum seekers who were peering out of the windows on the upper floors of the hotel. After discussions between themselves and police around 8 p.m, the counter-protesters left the area, and they decided to leave their placards and signs in bushes to avoid others seeing them with that material, as it would have been considered dangerous at this point. Next slide, please. At around 8:21, police issue a statement online stating that officers are in protective gear and are in attendance at the event. The images that you see here are an accumulation of incidents happening around this time, including individuals taunting police and vandalising surrounding fixtures, which included road signs, barriers, and using them alongside other materials as missiles thrown towards police, and also to break windows of the hotel. Next slide, please. And again, this next slide will be more images taken from video footage to present the events in this stage, which ultimately led to phase 3. Next slide, please. To lead us into the next phase, you can see here that Tommy Robinson began updating his Twitter profile from around 8:25 to 8:52, which is when we begin to see the images and footage of the protesters gaining entry to the hotel. That was through vandalised windows and fire exits, and they began to ignite fires. And the next slide documents how that was done. Next slide, please. So using shields to block the broken doorway, police resisted the continuing attacks, including at one point 8 participants dressed in black with face coverings, using a tree as a battering ram. And at around 8:50, the police officers withdrew from the doorway after one of them was doused in petrol by a participant and set alight. Over the next few minutes, flammable liquids and gases were sprayed into the corridor and a petrol bomb was thrown, which created a blaze inside the hotel. And this fire continued for more than an hour before finally being extinguished. Racist graffiti was also sprayed on the walls of the hotel, and inside the security manager made the decision to ask residents to stay behind rather than evacuate, as you would normally do for a fire. And this was as the threat level began to rise, the residents and the security team evacuated upwards rather than down, along with staff floor by floor. In another video, police are seen with multiple police dogs aiming to disperse the crowds with little success. And at around 9:40, police issue a statement urging members of the public to avoid the area. Next slide, please. And apologies if you can hear my dog in the background. So whilst the fire started in the hotel, some groups of participants were now moving onto the slip road and junction, which police had blocked off to traffic. This is the beginning of phase 4, which is then also when additional police support arrives wearing heavy-duty riot gear. By this stage, a helicopter from the National Police Air Service had arrived and began using its spotlight to try and identify participants. And at about 9:40, Staff's police issued another warning, urging members of the public to avoid the area around the Holiday Inn Tamworth. By 10, the additional police support units requested by commanders had arrived at the hotel, significantly improving morale against the frontline police officers present, and they had been under sustained attack for more than 2 hours. At this stage, dispersal techniques were now possible and employed by driving the now dwindling numbers of participants out of the hotel's car park and away from the slip road. They also dispersed them in small groups into Tamworth town centre. Next slide, please. So we ultimately reach phase 5, where data shows that it all fizzled out by around midnight, and this was confirmed by Staff's police, stating that at 12 on the dot, the disorder in Tamworth has ended after being successfully dispersed and appealing for witness information. Inside the hotel, the security team and police helped extinguish the fire and secured the building. And at around the same time, MP Sarah Edwards tweets that the scenes in Tamworth tonight of violence are shocking and disgraceful and are still ongoing, and she thanks police. Next slide, please. So in the aftermath of these events, and when we look at the figures, 72 arrestees were arrested, and it suggests that a significant proportion of the crowd was working class participants, largely from the town and its local area, with previous criminal records, particularly violence, and of a relatively wide age range. Based on our triangulated evidence, most of the participants were white and most were men. And to finish, on the next slide, it is important to note the varied communication within police, security organisations of the hotel, and with members of the local community and the planned protest. It's pretty clear from the data collected that the event in Tamworth was an attack rather than a peaceful protest as advertised. And compared to the other case studies in today's webinar, Tamworth has a much lower attendance of counter-protesters. Furthermore, we encountered challenges in collecting this data, as Tamworth was not well documented as some of the other case studies were. This includes the key Facebook group with the planning information, which was deleted before data collection began. We also have interview data that suggests that much of the documented footage was live on platforms like TikTok, and therefore it wasn't saved. I'm going to thank you now for your time as I'll hand it over to Kitty.
Thanks, Niamh. My name's Kitty Saunders, and I'm going to present to you the 2 events in Bristol on the 3rd and 7th of August. Next slide, please. I'm going to begin with the 3rd of August, which was the Saturday, and unlike the previous presentations, as I've got 2 events to go through, I won't give as much background detail, but I'm going to go through in detail what actually happened on the day itself. So here's a map of Bristol, and you can see in red some key locations pointed out for the events, and you can see in blue some key counter-protester movements. So red were the anti-immigrant participant movements and blue were the counter-protester movements. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of build up to this event. There were lots of e-flyers going around. So on the left-hand side, you can see the first anti-immigrant group flyer, 7 p.m, meet at Castle Park. And there's lots of the kind of classic tropes that we were hearing at the time, like hashtag stop the boats. And on the direct other side of the slide, you can see a kind of more filled out, more fleshed out version of this that was circulated on the 3rd of August. And that suggested that actually there was going to be a march down Redcliffe Hill, which heads towards a key hotel in this incident, and that there would be a demonstration. And in the middle, you can see a counter-protester flyer suggesting they'd meet 1 hour earlier in Castle Park on Saturday, the 3rd of August, to see off the group who were convening there. Next slide, please. So the police got wind of there being an event on about Thursday, 1st of August. They'd heard that it was being planned by a brand new youth right-wing group, but either way, they held a planning meeting. On Friday the 2nd, they then saw the second e-flyer that I showed you that suggested a 20-minute march, and they discussed that also at a planning meeting. And they put in section 60, 60AA and 35 dispersal zone in place. So those are about being able to move people on, remove masks and so on. And they also ensured that there were mutual aid police support units open for their use from other locations like Wiltshire and Devon and Cornwall. They had mounted police officers, dog units, a drone team, an evidence gathering team. All of this just to say that they were really well resourced, and much more so than would be expected for a kind of regular protest. And then on Saturday the 3rd, in the day before the event happened, there was a police briefing that stated that they thought that the extreme right wing and the extreme left wing crowds were both going to be high risk at this event. And there were 3 potential hotel targets that they knew of that housed refugees, for example, but the Mercure Hotel in Redcliffe was likely the target of the protesters. So as a result of that, I've highlighted this in red because it's very important for what happens later, they deployed 1 police support unit to the Mercure Hotel immediately. Next slide, please. So the counter-protest begins in Castle Park, and you can see in the middle picture here the group gathering, Lorraine Francis giving a speech to counter-protesters. This was all kind of really well received, and it was a very kind of positive moment in this incident overall. There was 1 person taken out of the crowd booed at this, but it was very isolated. And on the left, you can see the mounted police kind of arriving at Castle Park early in the evening. Next slide, please. So true to their word, they arrived, the anti-immigrant group arrived about 7 o'clock, maybe just before, and immediately sort of racist verbal abuse is being thrown around. The image on the left is from police body cam footage. This person ended up being prosecuted. And the picture on the left kind of shows actually what this man was looking at. So he's actually in the middle of that photo. And you can see that the police have formed a line between the anti-immigrant group on the right-hand side and the counter-protesters who are behind the police line. Next slide, please. The tensions are increasing, and so the police begin to escalate their responses. You can see on this slide here, the dogs are arriving, and in the middle there are kind of physical clashes beginning between the police and the protesters who are there. You can also see from our eyewitness testimony that there's observation of Nazi salutes, which are obviously really upsetting, and there's observations that the police are trying to hold a barrier between the anti-immigrant participants and the counter-protesters. Next slide, please. So at about 7:30, it really sort of the clashes begin to really escalate. There's missiles being thrown at mounted police, and you can see in the middle there that the police officers are being swapped out for those in riot gear. The screenshot on the right-hand side is from a video that is very violent, and it involves police trying to move the protesters, the anti-immigrant group, towards Bristol Bridge and away from the park. And it's very violent between the anti-immigrant group and the police, and the anti-immigrant group and the counter-protesters, with the anti-immigrant group being the primary antagonists of that disorder. Next slide, please. So 2 things happen at this time point. I'll talk first about what's happening on the bridge. So as I've just said, the police are moving the anti-immigrant group towards the bridge. And it becomes a really chaotic, violent scene. There's lots of verbal abuse being thrown around. The dogs are deployed, so there's dog bites happening. There are arrests being captured on video, and there's just general kind of chaos and physical violence happening. At about 10 to 8, there's a message that one of our eyewitnesses received saying that there were about 60 far-right arriving at the Mercure, and that's the hotel that really is the epicenter of a lot of this disorder. So although there had been a police presence at the Mercure Hotel an hour previously, the police support unit was withdrawn to aid the policing situation in Castle Park, which, as I've said, was escalating in tension. The police from that unit were then redeployed to organise the protection of the hotel, to protect the staff, but they were given incorrect information and they were sent to a Holiday Inn hotel instead of back to the Mercure. So at around sort of 7:50, 7:55, anti-immigrant participants arrived at the hotel when it was completely unguarded. But our eyewitnesses suggested that because it wasn't protected, they didn't know if they were in the right place perhaps, or they weren't sure what they should do. And so they didn't attack it immediately. But it was a very frightening moment for those people. About 5 minutes later, counter-protesters arrived who had circumvented down that blue arrow that I showed you at the beginning around the back of the police cordons that had been put on Bristol Bridge to get to the hotel. And they were followed by 7 officers on bicycles. Next slide, please. So we then arrive at the Mercure Hotel. So as you can see in the photo at the bottom left, there are police in high-vis jackets on bicycles. Those are the ones who arrived from following the counter-protesters. And this scene is just really super violent. The video at the bottom right is of the kind of anti-immigrant protesting group fighting with the counter-protesters who have created a protective barrier in front of the hotel. They're linking arms and chanting and having to defend themselves and fight back. Many of those at the very front line of that disorder were arrested. And from the eyewitness testimony, it's quite interesting. They've said their very first line, there's no visible police presence at this time. And I think that just speaks to how many people are present at that moment. The police are there, but they're hugely outnumbered by the number of protesters and counter-protesters who were there. Next slide, please. So from about 8:30, the mounted police and the support PSUs arrive. So these are the mutual aid police support units in the picture on the left. They're from Devon and Cornwall. And on the right, you can see that by 9 o'clock, the police have set up a line outside the hotel and the counter-protesters are still holding that kind of immediate protective layer outside the hotel's front door. The anti-immigrant group at this time are kind of standing behind where the photographer of these 2 videos is standing. Next slide, please. The anti-immigrant group are sort of seen off from the hotel and they head down towards Redcliffe Roundabout where the disorder continues. There is lots of verbal abuse thrown around, including kind of anti-Semitic statements. And the PSUs are forming a line across the main road that leads back up to the hotel to prevent them from going back in that direction. And the police begin pushing them back in towards Portwall Lane car park and away from the hotel. Next slide, please. The activity begins to wind down. The police are holding the line, but as you can see in that left-hand side, they've taken their helmets off. There's less of a risk for them at that moment. And at about 10:30, the human shield outside the Mercure Hotel head home. Next slide, please. So some key points, the anti-immigration group, despite what they suggested, they did not protest. They arrived and were instantly violent and aggressive. The police were really well staffed and resourced, but just at that key moment, they were misplaced and weren't outside the hotel where they needed to be. The counter-protesters played a really key role in this event, reclaiming Bristol, but also protecting that hotel. And the group identities were not straightforward. There were lots of different messages in the verbal abuse being used, and including kind of flags and signs. The group identities weren't easy to categorise. Next slide, please. I'm now going to talk about the 7th of August on Wednesday. Next slide, please. Here's another map of Bristol, Castle Park in the middle, but actually all of the epicentre of activity here really is in the east of Bristol at Old Market, inside that red square, and there's a breakaway group of counter-protesters who followed that blue line, and I'll describe what happened there. Next slide, please. So in the build-up to the event, some messages were leaked from Telegram suggesting that the far right were going to gather outside immigration offices on West Street, and there was some really kind of emotive language. Wednesday needs to be a fire burning so bright they'll see the flames from space. And so the counter-protesters put out a flyer to see them off, and the police began putting out dispersal orders and sending officers to Old Market. Next slide, please. And again. Thank you. So the police information for that day was a bit difficult to kind of work out. So they didn't have any information that there was a march planned. They suggested that any information that was about a march was misinformation. But they did have reports of a plan to march to Old Market. And they really asked the public to feed information back to them so they could work out more what was going on. But the counter-protesters showed up anyway to the immigration office, and you can see on the right-hand side at about 6:40 that evening, counter-protesters showed up, and you can also see boarded up shop fronts, so clearly there's a sort of atmosphere of fear of what might happen. Next slide, please. By about 7 o'clock, there's a huge crowd gathering on West Street and Old Market, but as you can see in that photo, people are smiling. There are some masks worn, which wasn't permitted, but generally it's quite a sort of amiable crowd. And this goes on for about an hour. There's a picture there of the mounted police walking up West Street, but they're walking alongside counter-protesters quite happily with their visors up. They're clearly not expecting any disorder right at that moment. But just before 8 o'clock, the tone changes and a breakaway counter-protester crowd moves towards the centre from West Street and Old Market. And a reporter at the scene said that they had no idea what was going on. People had heard that the far right were gathering at the centre, and that was a rumour that was going around, and that this group had gone to basically see them off in the centre of town. They moved very quickly. As you can see, they masked up and hooded up, and the police were trying to keep pace, but the reporter said they were struggling to. Next slide, please. There was an isolated incident about this time of a firework being set off in Castle Park, but it didn't lead to anything other or any other incidents. Next slide, please. And as the group arrived in the centre, as you can see on the left-hand side, there's a video there, screenshot from a video of the crowd clapping because they've arrived and they realise that the far right aren't there. And so there's a kind of victorious feeling that they've seen them off and they're walking back towards Old Market. But on the right-hand side, you can actually see Old Market at the same time, still absolutely full of people. The breakaway group was a small group compared to who was left. Next slide, please. And at about 9 o'clock, just before the protest starts winding down, people start kind of bedding in for a sort of nice celebratory evening. The live blog post that we've quoted here says that there was a massive queue for the only offie that stayed open. People were lining up to get a drink. Next slide, please. And while large numbers remained at Old Market and the police were still there holding a line, it was quite a discreet presence, and it was mainly just because the road was closed. Next slide, please. There was one scuffle just before 10 o'clock. Somebody threw a missile at a police van. The police then found that person in the crowd, and there was a sort of bit of a scuffle, but it didn't sort of escalate into anything more than that. That person was arrested and then I think released. And the street party continued, so people were dancing in the street. There was a DJ declaring this is a victory against the fascists, and by 11 o'clock, the sound system was off, the road was reopened, and the crowd moved on. Next slide, please. So just some final key points. The police were definitely in attendance at this event, but there were largely peaceful relations and nothing like the Saturday that we saw before. Misinformation on far-right gatherings at the immigration lawyer's office led to the counter-protest happening, but I will say it doesn't mean the far-right didn't appear at any point, but they were definitely outnumbered if they did, and they didn't act in the way that they did on the Saturday at all. Misinformation led to a breakaway group moving towards the centre of town, so it did affect kind of real-time movements on that day, but overall there was a huge atmosphere of kind of victory and celebration that the counter-protesters had seen off the far right and had reclaimed their city. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand back over now to the rest of the team.
Thanks, and we'll hand back to John, who's just going to give some conclusions and findings and discussion.
So yeah, thanks very much. So now I'm going to draw out some answers to the questions we raised at the beginning from the three case studies in the data set as a whole. Our overall question underlying specific questions that we had was around exactly what happened, what people did. And within that, we had a question about whether these events could be categorized as protests, because many in the media referred to them as protests. Were they protests? We concluded that they were not. They would not be accurately described as protests, despite the fact that many were advertised as such, because they didn't really have the accoutrements of protests. You didn't see many banners, and they didn't have marches with slogans and so on. They largely involved violent attacks or attempted attacks on asylum seekers' accommodation and on police and counter-protesters standing in their way. And it's true that not everybody present joined in with the violence, but it was also true that nobody in the crowds of anti-immigrant participants actually challenged the violent acts. And there could be multiple reasons for that. But it was also notable that those violent acts, those attacks on those buildings were cheered by those who didn't join in. I mentioned at the beginning the role of the police because our previous research has identified a pattern in which a previously peaceful crowd becomes conflictual, becomes violent after certain kinds of interventions by the police seen as illegitimate and indiscriminate by members of the crowd. This wasn't the case here. There was no pattern like that we observed in the three case studies we looked at. The other question, the main question, was around the identities of the participants. Who were they? So at a descriptive level, you could characterize them as ethnically homogeneous. They were largely white people, and they were seeking to attack minoritized ethnic groups. Now, we didn't manage to interview any of the anti-immigrant participants. Initial attempts to do that met with hostility and suspicion. But we did get a lot of data. We got a lot of visual data. We got a lot of recorded things that they were saying, things that they shouted. And we calculate that we had data on the utterances and slogans and so on of around half of the participants whose views could be characterized as anti-immigrant, racist, anti-Muslim, and so on. And yet at the same time, we want to push back against that assumption that everybody present was simply the same, or everybody was there for the same reason. We want to question that, because although there were far-right activists involved and people involved with football risk groups who were also linked with the far right, there were people there who might not be affiliated. There were people there who seemed to be there for anti-police reasons. And at least in some of the events we looked at, there were people who maybe had not planned to be there, were bystanders who joined in spontaneously. So this isn't an argument that they weren't all racist, because they do appear to be racist. These were racist acts by and large that seem to be supported. But it's an argument that perhaps there were other reasons why people were there, and that wasn't the main reason for some of them. And a third conclusion in terms of who was involved was we sometimes think of events like these and riots as consisting of two groups, the authorities, the police on the one hand, and the rioters in the other. But these events were characterised by the presence of multiple groups. There were the anti-immigrant participants themselves, the police, a large counter-protest group, and you didn't see that in the riots in 2011, for example. And as well as that, certainly in Hanley, you had a very large group of, we've called them local community defenders. They weren't part of the official counter-protest. They were there simply to defend their mosque. So this work allowed us to make some comparisons with the 2011 riots, and I'm going to say a few words about that because we have been asked repeatedly to make that comparison. And the first observation is that both of these waves were associated with towns and cities and locations of towns and cities where there was high areas of deprivation, although it's important to recognise too that these were different locations on each occasion, different towns or different parts of cities that got involved in these two waves of events. These were two very different groups of people. And so I think we might argue that the differences between them, I mean, these were both waves of multiple violent events, but we might argue that the differences, there were more differences than similarities. And I think the context is part of the difference. I mean, one obvious feature of the recent wave is the context of rising anti-immigrant sentiment stoked by the authorities. You've got the rise of Reform UK, who only recently done well in the general election. So all that is telling you that public opinion, or people might interpret public opinion to be more anti-immigrant than it was in 2011, which you might argue might give confidence to those who are strongly anti-immigrant to think that public opinion is on their side. A second difference is the events in 2011 were initiated by the police killing of a mixed heritage man in North London. And there was a strong theme, though not everybody who joined in was an ethnic minority, there was a strong theme of fighting back against police racism amongst some participants, particularly in parts of London. So an anti-racist theme, if you like, whereas in 2024, it was the opposite. These were events against ethnic minorities, not just asylum seekers, but also Muslims. A third difference is what happened in 2024, unlike 2011, had a kind of campaign element. Although you had, the death of Mark Duggan in 2011, which angered and mobilised some people, there wasn't a kind of national campaign that encouraged people to come out on the streets like there was in 2024, where there were local groups who had existing Facebook pages and groups who organised and encouraged people to respond to the murders in Southport and to the wider issue of immigration. And the final difference is there was widespread looting in 2011, and this was much less evident in 2024, although there was some. So this was a small-scale project. We only looked at 3 case studies in 29. So there are obvious questions we haven't fully addressed. I mean, one thing, given that we didn't hear from the anti-immigrant participants, that's missing that we would like to look at is who they thought they represented. We've got a sense, and there's some indirect evidence in the data we have got, that they, some of them at least, felt that they stood for their local communities. They believed that their local communities didn't want these accommodations for asylum seekers in their towns. They felt that their local town was on their side. Many of them got involved in these events without masks or any attempt to protect their identity, perhaps thinking that they had legitimacy. Secondly, we've seen, particularly in the case of Bristol, the importance of the counter-protest as a possible expression of the community. So if the community is not this anti-immigrant, doesn't have this anti-immigrant view, perhaps the community is anti-racist. And if you see a strong anti-racist response in your local community, what does that tell you about what public opinion is locally? So the counter-protests perhaps have consequences for how we think of what other people think too, which then might affect our own actions locally. For example, if you think that most of your neighbours are racist, that might deter you from intervening if you see a racist incident in the street. You might think, well, I won't get involved because, you know, nobody's going to back me up if I get involved here. Whereas if you think that public opinion locally is anti-racist, then perhaps you will have the confidence to get involved if you see an incident. So that links with our final comment, which is, what do these events and the counter protests, how do they impact upon wider public opinion, not just public opinion in the local areas, about what they think about immigration? Do they think that immigration is strongly think that immigration is very bad, or are they more willing to celebrate it? So we don't know that either, and we'd like to. So just some concluding remarks. One, what struck me about the 3 case studies, and perhaps you noticed this as well, was a significant variety across them. We might think when we hear of a wave of riots that they all take the same form, they're all very similar, but the 3 events we've talked to you about were all very different, in fact, in terms of the success of the rioters, the different people involved, the balance of forces and so on. Although we haven't shown conclusively that there were not just far-right people involved in these events, we have at least, I think, questioned that assumption that everybody involved was the same kind of person, that therefore policy solutions should simply address that same kind of person. And then finally, there's a practical question, and somebody's already raised this in the Q&A, but there's a real problem we've got in the UK and probably other countries as well of carrying out serious large-scale research when there's a crisis. Because policymakers need the data, they need the evidence, right? They need it immediately because they want to have responses very quickly. But the research funding process is very long-winded, as we all know. It takes months and months to put the proposal together to get funding to carry it out. So we need something different for crisis if we want more work like this. So finally, just let me name the whole team. This was a very large team of people, a large group of people who got involved in this work, and they should all be acknowledged. If you want to see more, there's a QR code for the preprint of the paper, and you can visit the OSF site with all our materials at that link. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you very much to the other speakers. And now I know some colleagues have had to drop off, no doubt, as we're past 12, but we will continue for a little while just in terms of the participants who are still able to stay on the line with some excellent questions that are being popped in the chat. Let me start, John and colleagues, with a couple of methods points. So one of the top upvoted questions is from Olivia Leonard. We did have challenges in this respect, Olivia, which I'm sure John can explain. Did you capture any information perspectives of the asylum seekers or those who experienced the riots? And secondly, how do we select the case studies? So let's start with those 2 questions. Thank you. John, do you want to speak to that? Oh, we might have just lost John. So let me ask Kitty, if you wouldn't mind, just to explain about the limitations of interviewing others that we weren't able to reach. Thank you. And the selection of the case studies.
So it's a really good question. So this study, as we kind of said, was so fast. And we did actually manage to do a really great number of interviews with people across all different kind of categories in these issues and these incidents that happened. We interviewed many members of the public, and we interviewed counter-protesters, so not just people who were in that kind of community defender category in Hanley, but across Bristol as well, and got loads of interesting insights from them. The challenge, because of the short kind of nature of this study and what we were aiming to do, was that we primarily asked them questions and used the information about what happened and how could we use what they said to build our timelines and understand more about what actually happened, rather than focusing in that really qualitative way about how they felt about what was happening. There is a paper being written at the moment about kind of meta perceptions in Bristol by one of the members of the team. That's not yet kind of ready for sharing, but I hope that we will be able to share more about those insights soon. I will also flag that the interviews where we had permission to do so are actually shared on the OSF site. So for many of the kind of members of the public interviews, those are actually available to read. So if you wanted to get a bit more of a flavour of how people felt about what happened in their locations, those are available online. And I think we can probably share the link to that directly in the chat, or maybe in response to your question. In terms of choosing the 3 locations, just to briefly say, we had to pick ones where we knew we had connections, where we knew we had people that we could call upon, just again because of the nature of the very quick turnaround for this project. So for instance, we had really good connections with the police in certain locations, and so it was, you know, the locations were chosen for that reason. So it was a very kind of practical choice, rather than trying to diversify in any kind of meaningful way, but instead prioritizing getting things done quickly and completely as completely as possible.
Thanks very much, Kitty. And yeah, just to add, obviously very challenging to get access to some of the asylum seekers that were affected. So we're not able to do those interviews, but we recognise that. And in the preprint, you'll see some of those limitations acknowledged in that limitations section in the discussion. And so some other excellent questions here. I'm just looking at the down at the list. So I guess the other issue I just asked about, and John started to answer this, is the gendered aspect of the riots and the participants. So would anybody like to comment on that? Julze, I don't know whether you would just like to comment on some of the gendered aspects of this. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Linda. So as John mentioned, I think, which was already answered, there were more men in the riots across all the case studies. In terms of the role, I think there was a mix. We cannot really identify what was the role of the women in the riots and also the men, because it's not part of like how we investigated it. But like in terms of like arrest data, there were definitely more men who were involved in the riots. Maybe during in the counter-protesters group, but also community defenders, but also the anti-immigrant participants as well.
I can add to that as well.
Yes, thanks, Niamh.
So with the case study in Tamworth, there was some miscommunication about what the protest would look like. And there was posts alluding to the fact that there might even be kind of like a family barbecue at the location of the Holiday Inn prior to the protest taking place. And so we feel that that gained a lot of traction from family members, and that's why there was more family groups involved in Tamworth, and there were certainly women involved in those as well. But when we think about the actual acts of violence, like the members and the groups rushing towards the police, when we looked at the video evidence for that, it did look to be majority men. So that's why Tamworth is slightly different.
Thanks, Niamh. John, I don't know, are you with us, John? I think we may have still lost John. John does have a student who's just come out of his Viva, or her Viva, so I think that may be a feature here. Let me just have a quick look. I was going to pose one question to John. So back to you, Kitty. Lois has got a question, excuse me, on why do you think there was such a de-escalation in Bristol between the 3rd and the 7th?
Great question. I think it's probably the question of the day, really, because I think it's such an important point. Why did the anti-immigrant group not come back in such force on that Wednesday? There are some kind of practical suggestions. It was a weekday, perhaps people were going back to work, and the first event was on a Saturday. But I think there's probably a huge role to play of the counter protests here. In Bristol, it was such a huge turnout. And I think, I mean, I don't know this for a fact because, as I say, we haven't interviewed the anti-immigrant group, but I don't think there was an expectation that the counter protest would be as large as it was. And it turned out again in similar force on the Wednesday. And I think it feeds into those really interesting questions, which again, we don't have firm answers for, but that we can kind of make some good suggestions around of what does the turnout of counter protesters say about what the people think, the people in inverted commas, you know, us as a society, us as a public. What do we believe about anti-immigrants, anti-immigration, or refugees living in hotels? And really the turnout in Bristol of the counter-protesters directly challenged their belief that perhaps they held the majority view. So I think that's it's a wonderful question that I think really needs a lot of thought about why do these things stop? And while we don't have clear answers, I think the counter protests were such a kind of huge part of why maybe Wednesday didn't turn out the same as Saturday.
Thanks, Kitty. And another very popular question, Kitty, Julze, Niamh, I don't know if any of you feel you can answer this, is how much do we think the media participating, this is from Kirsty Henderson, participating in these being framed as protests was about reflecting their editorial house style or actually tempering some of the audiences that might be open to some of the counter-protest activity, the Mail, etc. Now, I know in your desk-based research, you spend a lot of time looking at media coverage. So any reflections from any of you on that? Thank you.
I can go first. I think that's a really great question. The media, especially like different forms of media, like news articles, social media, has a very critical role in this kind of events. The way we label or categorize people, for example, the way how we call them would have a really, really significant impact on how other people perceive the groups that were involved in this event. Like, for example, in one of the interviews that I've analyzed, there, like, if you see across the preprint, there was a lot of mention about Asian young men. And I think that's like a very important thing to highlight because one of the interviewers mentioned, let's just use Asian young men as a shorthand because it's easier. I think we need to be very responsible on how we report these categories in social media, in news articles, because if we're just going to group these individuals, not just ethnic minorities, but also those other anti-immigrant participants, we are creating more division. We're creating, we especially if we're not really sure of like the composition of the group, we need to be really responsible of how we categorize the people involved in this riots because that would create more tension.
Thank you, Jules. Really helpful response. So John is with us. And John, if you could just have a look at the questions from Katie O'Neill and Hannah Bateson in the chat. So we haven't highlighted in this presentation the findings on policing. Our colleagues that collaborated with us have focused on that more. And perhaps Sancha can pop in the chat. We did submit some evidence to the Home Affairs Committee that I think is relevant. So Hannah, I'm sorry, this is jumping around in front of me. First of all, John, can we make any parallels with the events in Los Angeles at the moment? A very timely question from Katie O'Neill. And then just anything you'd like to comment on in relation to policing. Thanks.
I'm a bit hesitant to make parallels with LA. I mean, this is one of the arguments with this work we're describing, that people are quite ready to jump in. Right, I have been trying to follow what's been going on in LA. I notice a correlation between the arrival of the more riot-oriented security services and the increase in collective violence. Okay, so that's a common correlation, but that we've seen before. But in terms of the process, I don't know because I don't know enough about it. So I'd like to say more, but I'm hesitant because I don't know enough about it. Any insights on police interventions that made certain approaches better than others? Yeah, I think it might have come through. You might have got a sense from what happened in Tamworth and what happened in Bristol is that the police seemed a little unprepared, as in perhaps underestimating the threat of the anti-immigrant groups, and in the case of Bristol, seeing the counter-protesters, at least initially, as a problem to be solved as well, and then kind of backtracking on that and revising what they were doing. So it kind of looks like they needed to understand the threat of the anti-immigrant groups a bit more accurately. And of course, what happened in these events wasn't entirely new. You remember there was an attack on an asylum seekers accommodation near Liverpool only a couple of years ago. So these things had already happened. And, so perhaps it would have been better to understand what the threat was on the day and to mobilise sufficient forces to prevent violence. Although you've got to say that in Tamworth the police weren't there, and the police were very brave in the end. If the police weren't there, people likely would have been killed, because unlike Bristol, unlike Stoke, there simply wasn't the kind of community defence element to protect people. I mean, the community defence elements in both Bristol and Stoke outnumbered the anti-immigrants. Okay, but in Tamworth it was the other way round, and you saw from those pictures there was quite a thin blue line. So remarkably brave, and obviously suffered a lot of injuries.
Thanks, John. I'm just going to ask you two other questions, and of course, other colleagues can come in. So the first question at the top, I guess we're going to speculate here, but the question is why not Wales? Why is there not violence at this level in other devolved nations, Wales and Scotland specifically? Up here, I know there was a lot of narrative about why that wasn't the case, but we are speculating. Obviously, there were events in Northern Ireland, and then excuse me, there is a question about socio-economic interventions from Lauren in the chat. Did your work explore, and this is difficult to answer, what specific interventions might help address the anti-immigrant sentiment within these groups, particularly given the demographics being predominantly from lower socioeconomic groups? Thanks, Lauren, for that question. Yeah,
in terms of why some places didn't riot and others did, I mean, you can say the same about swathes of England. I mean, 27 locations in England, many places didn't. And as I mentioned, it was mostly different places than rioted in 2011. And in 2011, you had the same kind of question. Why didn't Scotland join in? Why didn't the northeast of England join in? Why was it these places? And these places in 2011 that were mostly the same places as in 1985 and 1981. What is it about those places? It's a great question. It goes to questions of the history of the particular location. If you listen to the accounts of participants, and I'm basing this on our 2011 study, accounts from participants then, why did you riot in Birmingham after you heard about what happened in London? And people start to say, well, okay, I thought when it happened there, I thought it would happen here, and it becomes an almost self-fulfilling prophecy. But why did you think it would happen there? Because Birmingham, or that area of Birmingham, already had a history of disorder, of resistance. So there's something about those places where things have already happened, and there's an identity, if you like, that enhances an expectation that other local people will assemble. And you might say that about Tamworth. So why did Tamworth? Why did people assemble in Tamworth? So you might say that, well, people in Tamworth, given that what happened in other places by then, in Stoke, in Southport, and so on, in Middlesbrough and Manchester, knowing that there's groups of people who are campaigning on this anti-immigrant ticket, then thinking, well, it's going to happen here too, and then assembling. So those places that didn't, they probably haven't got that history. That's my answer to that. So the other question, which I can't find now, about
was really just about whether there are socioeconomic interventions to think about it's disenfranchisement, isn't it, John? Thanks.
Yes. So as I said in one of my slides, certainly most of the locations in 2024, like all of the locations in 2011, are areas of deprivation. But many areas of deprivation didn't riot, right? So it can't be that. Again, so it's something about, you know, the identity, the history, sometimes the relationship with the police. That was certainly the case in 2011. It can't just be deprivation. It's got to be something else. And there's a general framework that we use when understanding collective action. There's three dimensions, if you like. So one is the kind of grievance dimension. So you could say, okay, they've got grievances around, you know, deprivation. They've got grievances around, you know, immigration and so on. But there's also two other factors. I mentioned identity, like who we are. This is our history. This is what people here believe in and likely to do. But the other dimension is efficacy, which is the confidence to do something, right? And those places where it happens, if you listen to the voices of people who participated, there's a kind of confidence there that there's enough people who feel the same way to make this happen. They've got that belief. So it's not, yeah, deprivation is part of it, but it's not the only part, because it's insufficient to explain which places get involved, and so any solution around deprivation is itself probably insufficient.
Thanks.
I mean, if you're asking me for solutions, I mean, nobody's said that yet. Well, I will say a word or two about it. So I think it lies in the community, right? I mean, what happened? I think Kitty's presentation brought this out. After that Wednesday, the 7th of August, it wasn't just in Bristol, it was across the country. I went to one in Brighton and it was absolutely huge. It was hundreds and hundreds of people, and it was a good atmosphere. And there were varied people, all sorts of people, not people who were particularly political, a lot of them, although there were political people there. There was a positive relationship with the police as well. And you got that sense that they were saying, this is the community, public opinion. Right, so I think that is the solution. And, again, it's a correlation, but you didn't get any more of those anti-immigrant violent mobilizations after that Wednesday, right? So, speculatively, you could say, well, the people that would otherwise be, mobilizing for the anti-immigrants would be thinking, well, look, public opinion is not as supportive of us as we thought, right? So, that I think that is part of the solution, the community response.
Thank you, John. Well, I think we've run out of time, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer all the questions, but just to flag, there is a question about mis and disinformation in the Q&A box, something we did look at in this study in terms of the material that was circulated, but not in huge amounts of depth. And that is a topic that Behavioural Research UK is very interested in, and it has been looking at in other studies. And I know colleagues in a number of different sectors are also focusing on it at the moment, particularly given the global geopolitical context. So if you're interested in that, watch this space. We'll be coming back, hopefully with more research on that. But just remains for me to thank very much John, Professor Drury, for all his leadership on this project and all the contribution of the team, to Julze, Niamh and Kitty for incredibly hard work. I know it took a lot of time on the analysis and the writing up and your participation in this study. And everybody who stayed on the line during a busy day, I do appreciate it. So the link to the webinar will be available on the BR UK website under our webinar heading, and that will be posted ASAP by Ellie and colleagues. You can see our funder acknowledgement again here and all the partners who are involved in Behavioural Research UK. So thank you from me for joining this webinar today. And again, on the website, our future webinars will be there. So we'll sign off now. Thank you.